still,
Okay.
ours is better than the seniors.
First, a couple of announcements and things. I have one extra front page that goes in your portfolio. It says academic calendar and England prerequisites. If you're missing that page, it's kind of essential. It's page number 1. So if you don't have this one, let me know. Second, communication will come to you primarily through email. And if there's something urgent, I'll try to do morning announcements. And I assume most of the teachers are reading those with their classes each morning. I also will have It's Learning, and you, over the next week, will be added to a course on It's Learning, so that you have that as well. But I don't get to see you often enough to remind you of things. So I do need you to make sure that you're on task, on target, you know, meeting your deadlines and that kind of thing. If you have not signed up for Remind, then you need to look at the first email that I sent out. It went to your parents, and I asked them to forward it to you. And then yesterday, last night, I emailed all of you and also forwarded that same email. There's some information on there with how you can do that. That I'll primarily use the day before our meeting to say, hey, don't forget, Saturday morning, and here's where we're meeting, and that kind of thing. So I especially would like you to be on Remind. Andrew Barton, Grace Cox, Holland McCartney, Cam Kitchen, Seth Layton, and Cole Singleton. And there's one other. I have not received an email from you, so all I need you to do is just email me, and that way I have your email address and can add you to the group. You will know it's you, because if you didn't get an email from me from last night, then I don't have your email address yet. So thanks for taking care of that. Then we are ready to start talking about the work that's coming up. October the 7th is your Canterbury Tales test, objective test. Mostly multiple choice. It will not take you that long, maybe about 40 minutes, and then we'll move into the other component of our day. And then you have a poetry recitation due on November 11th. The start date of that is today, but I wanted to give you 2 months in case memorization is really outside of your comfort zone to do that. So I'm assigning it today, but it's not due until November the 11th. Okay, and then next class I'll mention that movie review coming up in November as well. So those are the 2 most pressing things. Canterbury Tales is the first priority. I know you heard me yesterday say that October the 14th I did not realize was part of your fall break, because it's not really a fall break for teachers, it's for you. We have off on a Monday. So I just put that on the calendar because it was the second Saturday, and then I started getting all these like, I can't be there, and realized why. So that will be on the 7th instead, giving you exactly a month to read Canterbury Tales. Now, Canterbury Tales is actually a collection of short stories, so you're not reading the whole thing. When the book comes in the mail, you're going to be like, that's a thick book. You are reading like 7 or 8 stories out of it, not the whole thing. Okay, so it's a collection, more or less, of short stories. So part of my objective today is to prep you for reading that book. Understand, when you go home today, you need to get your parents on Amazon and order this book. If you have an older sibling who has had me for England or British literature, they probably had this book. So if it's still around, you might be able to get it from a friend or older sibling or something. Because pretty much we've been doing the same book forever. So you don't necessarily have to get a brand new one. If you do go with Amazon, I think the paperbacks are $11 or Kindle is $7, something like that. Either one is fine because you're reading it independently. But it does have to be this version that's Joseph Glaser, because Canterbury Tales is written in Middle English. If you have the wrong book, it's not going to say exactly the same thing. And you certainly don't want to read it in the Middle English. I have had one student who did read it in the Middle English, and that would be like me trying to read Spanish. I'm going to understand about every sixth word or something. So you don't want to do that. Make sure it's Joseph Glaser. So you can't start on that until you get your book in. But if you're like on Amazon Prime, it could be to you by Monday if you'll order it today. Then you have that whole month to read. Okay, let's start with the development of the English language. I'm going to show you what English looked like in the beginning. And unfortunately, I can't get the sound to work in here today, so I can't show you what this sounds like, but I can tell you what Middle English sounds like. This is what Old English looks like. I mean, could you read what's in that brown box and get Over the Wells Road out of that?
Open.
It's a different language, right? But it's not. It is, but it's not. It is the first movement of the English language. Now, how did this come about? Here is why you brought paper and pen today, because you're going to start taking notes now. This is called the development of the English language. If you don't have paper, borrow from somebody around you. You can call this the development of the English language. So based on some fairly recent DNA testing, everybody has kind of come to the consensus that the first people to inhabit this island that we now call England or Britain, that the first inhabitants were Iberians. Iberians. I-B-E-R-I-A-N-S. Iberians. Have you heard of the Iberian Peninsula?
Yes.
Do you know what countries make up the Iberian Peninsula? That's where Spain and Portugal. Spain and Portugal are. So they believe that Iberian fishermen, basically Spanish fishermen, found the island first and chose to stay there because it was beautiful. So they became inhabitants. But the Spanish language had not fully developed at that point. So what they were speaking is what we call, hold on, I gotta think of this word, it's really cool. Paleo-Hispanic. Paleo-Hispanic, okay? So that means before the Spanish language. It's those tribal languages that eventually would become Spanish, but the Spanish language as we know it had a heavy Latin influence that came a little after this time period. So those were rooted in kind of what would eventually become the Spanish language, but we can't really call it Spanish at that point. Then you have the Celts, C-E-L-T-S, the Celts. And you may have heard of the Gaelic language before. The Celtic language is actually still alive and well in Wales, which is off the west, it's on the western coast of the island, and that is actually a separate country. We will cross the river, and actually one of our highlights of our tour is a visit to an abbey in Wales. So I don't know if you knew you're getting in two countries on this trip, England and Wales. So in Wales, all the signs have two languages written on them, and it's the Celtic or Gaelic and English. So that's still a pretty heavy influence. The reason is because as other groups like the Romans invaded the island, they pushed the existing inhabitants northward into what is Scotland and to the west, which is Wales. Okay, so that's why some of that language still exists there. The Romans invaded around 55 BC. Do you associate any particular emperor with that date? Julius Caesar, right? So during the time of Caesar's rule, it's the height of the Roman Empire, right? They're spreading all over the place. And they decided this island looked pretty good to them. Now the island at this time was called Brython, B-R-Y-T-H-O-N, Brython. And you can see how that could eventually develop to Britain. And so they called the people already living there the Brythons, the inhabitants of this island called Brython.
Can
Yes,
you spell Britain again?
B-R-Y-T-H-O-N, Brython. So the Romans, what language would they bring to the island? Latin. And they also contributed significantly in architecture, building roadways and walls. And the reason that's important is because when we're on tour, you will hear many of our guides and Matt say, you guys, this is remnants of Roman wall here, or these are the Roman baths. Bath, they pronounce Bath. It is one of the cities in England that we'll visit. So, during this time, Hadrian's Wall was built. It is in the northern part of England. Some people mistakenly think that it separates England from Scotland. It doesn't really. It's completely within England. Some parts of it are 2 feet tall, other parts of it are 10 feet tall. But there's a good chunk of Hadrian's Wall still existing. That happened during the Roman rule. Now, if I can dumb down history, because that's the way I need it to understand it. During this time that the Romans were the primary occupants and the leaders of this island, they're having trouble at home. So essentially, it wouldn't make sense to defend kind of these other lands if they're having trouble on the home front. So they withdraw from England, not completely, like there's still some guards on the wall, right? But they primarily withdraw to go home and help there, leaving England kind of, or Britain at the time, vulnerable. So I like to picture just across the water, or the European, it's Europe, and I just picture them with these telescopes like, hey, there's only 3 guards, this is our chance. Like, you know, this is not real, but they decide the country is vulnerable for attack. So you have 4 people groups kind of invading England after the Romans. Okay, and this is happening in the early 400s AD. So the Romans were the rulers there for quite a while, like 55 to 409-ish. So for the next 40 years, the 4 people groups invading England, definitely write these down, the Angles, A-N-G-L-E-S, Angles, the Saxons, S-A-X-O-N, Saxons, the Jutes, J-U-T-E-S, and the Danes, D-A-N-E-S. Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Danes. And you could put a little note that the Angles and the Saxons were Germanic tribes. So they are speaking tribal languages that we would classify as German. And then the Jutes and the Danes were Scandinavian Vikings. Scandinavian Vikings. So Scandinavia, like Sweden, Finland, Norway, Denmark, that's what we're talking about, okay? So they are attacking England. For 40 years, somebody's trying to really take hold of the land for their own. The Angles and the Saxons thought each other was cute, so they started intermarrying. Thus, their forces became stronger together, and they overpowered the Jutes and the Danes. So by 449, the Anglo-Saxons had established themselves as the dominant rulers on this island. 449, Anglo-Saxons. So those intermarriages contributed to really doubling their strength, and they take the island. But guess what? The Angles, they weren't content with this island being called Brython. They wanted it to be named after them. So they called it Anglaland. What? Angles called it Anglaland. land. And then, by the time Geoffrey Chaucer is writing during the Middle Ages, he was still using that word, but pronounced it England. England.
Can you
Can you spell that?
Anglaland, A-N-G-L-A, Angla land. All right, so that word is perfect to show you the movement of language, because here, this is the Anglo-Saxon language. This is really the birth of the English language. This is what it looked like. And it sounds like a German-Chinese blend. I can't do it, but like like I don't know, it's weird. It's very strange sounding to us. But we can't read it, we can't pronounce it, we have no idea what it says. So you would have to study it like you would an ancient language. You would learn it as a totally separate language if you were to study this at a school that offers like dead languages as a hobby. So the Angles and the Saxons ruled from 449 to 1066. And you need to know those bookend dates, 449 to 1066. This is 80. 449 to 1066. So that's the Anglo-Saxon rule. I don't know if you've ever heard of Alfred the Great. He was one of the great Anglo-Saxon leaders. These were warring people. Like, picture big, hefty, scary Vikings. They were not educated. They were not scholars. They were fighters. So most of them did not write because why would they? They weren't trained in that. They were trained in battle. But somebody has to record what they're talking about, and we attribute that primarily to either missionaries from Rome or monks from Ireland who were coming to witness to the pagan Anglo-Saxons. And so as the Anglo-Saxons were Christianized, their works are becoming more and more religious and spiritual. And a monk says, okay, this stuff is cool. Like maybe he sat around a campfire and heard them speaking this language, and their stories were passed on orally. Nobody was writing it down. And so probably a monk or a missionary thinks, we have to write this down because it tells us about this people group at this time. So they begin to record it, and this is what it looks like. You know? So we have to read a translation of it. Look in your binder for the poem on page 5. It says Caedmon's Hymn at the very top. This is a modern translation of an Anglo-Saxon poem. So Caedmon, his story is really interesting, and I will tell you more about it when we're in England. But Caedmon was a shepherd, and he didn't really have any skills in poetry or singing or instruments or anything like that. He had a reputation for, if at a party, everybody's like, okay, now for the entertainment. So we're going to go around, everybody tell a story or sing a song or play us a little music or something. He would sneak out the back door because he's like, I can't. Like, that's not his area of expertise. But one night, God spoke to him in a vision and essentially called him to speak biblical truths through poetic song. And he's like, Moses, like, I think you picked the wrong guy. I don't have the skill, you know. But God equipped him to do that, and he wrote amazing, inspired, anointed poetry about religious themes. But none of it survived because not many people were writing things down. He lived in an abbey, so he would have been around clergymen who were scholarly and could write. So it would have been recorded, but then the abbeys are burned down and things happen and stuff is lost. we have one poem of Caedmon's that survived, and it's the oldest known poem written in the English language, and it's this. The reason we have it is a man by the name of Venerable Bede, it looks like Venerable Bede, Venerable Bede wrote an ecclesiastical history of the English people. That was the name of his work, the ecclesiastical history of the English people. And in it, he tells us essentially about the Christianization of the Anglo-Saxons, the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons from pagan to Christian. And in it, he tells us the story of Caedmon and gives us this poem. That's how it survived. So this is like an incredible artifact, right? Because the only surviving Anglo-Saxon poem, the only one, and it's religious, and was composed in the Anglo-Saxon language. And you're going to memorize it, though, in modern English, so it means something to you, okay? I have put for you at the bottom some notes that I think will help you make sense of the poem, because if you understand it, you're going to be able to better memorize it. Now, there are different versions of this, because different people are going to translate the Anglo-Saxon language in slightly different ways. Same meaning, slightly different words. You must go by this one when you're reciting it to me. Okay. We are going to kind of fast forward now to the next big turn of events. What was it that happened in 1066 that ended the Anglo-Saxon rule? It was William the Conqueror of Normandy. William the Conqueror of Normandy, France. They invade and just squash the Anglo-Saxons. So what language are they bringing to the island now?
French.
Okay, so the French actually pushes the English language kind of in a new direction, because all of these people groups, the German, the Scandinavian, the Paleo-Hispanic, the Latin, all of this is kind of merging to form what is becoming the English language. So from 1066 to 1485, that's what we classify as the era known as the Middle Ages. Medieval literature, medieval folklore.
What was the second year?
1066 to 1485. So that's the Middle Ages. Now the English language starts to develop, and it looks like this in the black box. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote in the Middle English, and it starts to sound more like our language, or really it starts to look more like it. Can you pick out any words that you would recognize in the black box?
That.
April.
March.
Two.
The.
Route.
Okay, so you see some
Showers.
English words that you recognize.
Route.
Now your pronunciation would be bad if you tried to read this the way they spoke it. And you would only really pick up on every few words, but it wouldn't be highly intelligible. So I've given you the modern translation of that at the bottom. So what that really says is, when April with its showers sweet with fruit, the drought of March has pierced unto the root. Those are the first two lines of Canterbury Tales in Middle English. But we would struggle to get this out of that, I think. Okay, would you like to hear what Middle English sounds like?
Yes.
This is my one talent. One that April with his shore sota, the drought of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vine in sweet liquor, of which thereto engendered is the floor. When Zephyr seek with his sweet breed, and spirit hath in every hot and heath, the tundra cropis and the youngest honna, hath in the ramis have a corsirona, and small vale smaken melodie that sleepen all the neat with open ear. So pricketh them not to hear courages, than a longing folk to go in on pilgrimages. And palmeres for to seek in stranges strandes, to verne always coot and sundry landes, especially from every sheer is in of England and Canterbury they winde, the holy blissful martyr for to seek, that him hath opened one that they were seek at. That's the first 18 lines. That's the first 18 lines of the Canterbury Tales in Middle English. That's why you need to read a translation, because you don't know what I just said. Could have made it up. No. It's when you get your book, you can look on page 11 and 12. It actually has those lines in the Middle English, so you can see like, that was for real. But it is. But it essentially says, in that nice springtime weather, it's perfect for people going on pilgrimage. And so people from all over England travel to Canterbury to see the shrine of St. Thomas of Becket. That's how the story of the Canterbury Tales begins. So now you see the transition of the English language, and while I'm going to come back and focus on Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales for the last 10 minutes, I want to go ahead and show you what modern English looks like, as if you don't know. Can you read this?
Yeah. Next way.
Somebody read that. It's amazing. So you know the words, you know what each word means, and together you could make sense of the context, spending a little time talking about it. Guess who wrote this?
Shakespeare.
Shakespeare. These lines are from Othello. What am I saying? That Shakespeare is modern English? Oh my gosh. Because here's what I hear from students. They come to me after reading Macbeth and they're like, it was just hard because I don't understand that Old English. Old English? You saw what that looked like. That's not Old English. Shakespeare is modern. So we're talking 1485 on is modern English. How dare we call that modern? He's weird. No. He writes in words that we know. We can see them, we can pronounce them, and we can put them together to create meaning. It's really his syntax or the order of his sentences that's weird. And a few terms that we don't use anymore, we call that archaic, because it's just kind of died out over time. But Shakespeare is modern. Mind blown. Okay. So let's get back to Canterbury Tales. Geoffrey Chaucer is the author of the book. You are reading Joseph Glaser's translation of Canterbury Tales. Turn the page, and I want to show you what you have at your disposal in this handout. The Canterbury Tales test is not easy. So for the next few minutes, I'm going to tell you how to be successful and give you a few ideas at how to create meaning out of what you have to read. The first thing you're going to do is read this, because at the top of the page it says Introductory Notes for Reading the Canterbury Tales. I picked from Wikipedia, an English teacher, but I have already run through it to make sure it's accurate. I'm not going to give you inaccurate information. It's just they said it in such a nice way, I didn't have to. So it's all here for you. And there's some little comments from me that tells you how I'm going to draw this in when we get to England. Like, we're going to Canterbury, and we will go to a church service there. And then we're going to go to the cheesiest wax museum with authentic smells that you've ever seen. And we will laugh together about it. So you're going to read that, because guess what? In these 3 pages of introductory notes are all kinds of test questions, okay, about Geoffrey Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales and who's related to whom in this story. Then on the 4th page of that, you see Canterbury Pilgrims at the top. These are all the main characters of the Canterbury Tales. So this is a place for you to jot down, okay, here's what they looked like, here's what they did for a living, and it tells you other kind of things to look for. This is all from the general prologue. So the general prologue is one of the required readings in the Canterbury Tales. The general prologue means the introduction to all these stories that are about to happen. So this is where you get to know the characters, before they begin to tell their stories. Then, after that, you'll see the page that says Chaucer's Canterbury Tales Guided Reading Questions and Test Review. You can answer the Chaucer questions from the bio in the book or the intro notes that I just gave you. Then you have specific questions about the general prologue, and that's in addition to kind of the things that you wrote down about each character as you were reading. And then here's your stories. If they're not on this sheet, you do not have to read them, because your book will have many more stories than this, and they also have like introductions to each story. If it says prologue to the Wife of Bath's Tale, you don't have to read that. You read